There was no argument, no dramatic collapse, no obvious turning point anyone could identify later. It began softly, almost imperceptibly, the way genuine shifts in dynamic always do. A pause when you entered the room, a sentence left suspended. A glance exchanged that wasn't meant for you, yet you noticed it regardless. Conversations didn't end. They simply altered direction. Laughter grew quieter. Words became measured. People started selecting their language as though each statement needed validation before emerging. At first, it felt incidental. Coincidence, perhaps, but patterns don't deceive. And you've always possessed a talent for recognizing patterns long before others acknowledge their presence. The energy around you shifted subtly but unmistakably. Those who once spoke freely now guarded themselves. Those who dominated discussions suddenly deferred or fell silent. And behind closed doors you weren't meant to know existed, your name began appearing in exchanges that weren't praise and weren't accusations either. It was something more revealing than either category. They weren't angry with you. They weren't threatened in the obvious sense. They were unsettled because you weren't responding the way they anticipated. You weren't reaching for validation. You weren't attempting to demonstrate anything. You listened longer than required. You spoke less than was comfortable for them. And when you did contribute, it was never impulsive. It landed exactly where intended. That alone proved sufficient to disturb those who depend on disruption, chaos, and emotional leverage to maintain advantage. Soon the murmurs formed a sentence, a caution really not shouted, not even spoken with confidence, more like something shared in lowered voices, as though stating it too boldly might make it more real than they were prepared to encounter. Stay distant. Not because you were aggressive, not because you were harsh, but because you were perceptive. Because you recognized implications before intentions surfaced. Because you understood where discussions led before others recognized they were walking into them. You weren't participating in the same game. And worse for them, you understood their rules. People who rely on influence fear one element above all others, clarity, and you carried it without announcing it. You didn't rush to expose anyone. You didn't need to. You simply observed, retained, and waited. That patience was misinterpreted as passivity until it wasn't. That's when the second part of the caution emerged. They possess remarkable perception, not remarkable in terms of volatility or destruction. Remarkable because you couldn't be hurried, charmed, intimidated, or misled. Remarkable because you didn't require victory in every exchange. You only needed comprehension. Remarkable because once the entire framework becomes visible, pretense becomes unsustainable. And the most unsettling element for them wasn't what you articulated, it was what remained unspoken. Because silence when understanding exists is never empty. Why? Perception disturbs more than power. Power announces itself. It arrives with presence, demanding acknowledgement, compelling responses. Authority elevates its voice, demonstrates reach, and relies on visibility to sustain control. People understand how to respond to power because it is apparent. You either yield to it, oppose it, or attempt to match it. There are rules, familiar patterns, and expected outcomes. Even fear, when attached to power, possesses a shape people can recognize and prepare against. Perception operates differently. It doesn't need to declare itself, and that is precisely what renders it unsettling. It observes quietly, absorbing information while others are engaged in performance. It doesn't rush to act because it doesn't require speed. While power pushes forward, perception steps back, examines the landscape, and awaits the appropriate moment. This delay is often misinterpreted as weakness, but the error is temporary. Once people recognize what is occurring, discomfort emerges. What genuinely disturbs others is not the knowledge itself, but the timing. Perception anticipates outcomes before events unfold. It connects subtle behaviors, inconsistencies, and motivations into a complete picture long before anyone else suspects a picture exists. By the time others begin responding, the perceptive mind has already moved past reaction and into anticipation. That gap between what is happening and what is understood is where discomfort grows. Power can be confronted directly. It can be challenged, overcome, or revealed. Perception cannot be trapped so easily. You cannot debate someone who has already traced the logic of the situation to its conclusion. You cannot intimidate someone who understands the cost of every action before it occurs. Attempts to dominate fail because perception doesn't meet force with force. It redirects it, often without visible effort. This is where unease transforms into suspicion. People begin to feel examined, not in a paranoid sense, but in a deeply personal manner. They sense that their words are being heard beyond their surface meaning. Their actions feel recorded not literally but mentally. Perception remembers patterns, and once patterns are remembered, repetition becomes exposure. This makes careless behavior risky, and most people are careless far more frequently than they realize. Unlike power, perception doesn't require allies to be effective. It doesn't need permission or validation. It functions independently, quietly, and consistently. That independence threatens systems built on hierarchy and control. When someone cannot be pressured into conformity, cannot be drawn into emotional responses, and cannot be confused by contradiction, the usual methods cease functioning. The fear, then, is not of being attacked, but of being understood. Being understood removes leverage. It strips away illusion. It makes manipulation visible and posturing irrelevant. Power may compel compliance, but perception eliminates the need for force entirely. And that is why it unsettles people at a deeper level, because it doesn't challenge them openly. It simply transcends the game they continue attempting to play. When people recognize you perceive the entire board, most individuals move through existence one step at a time, responding to what is directly in front of them. They focus on the immediate moment, the next sentence, the next response, the next small advantage. Their thinking is linear, narrow, and reactive. They believe progress emerges through quick moves and bold confidence. For an extended period, this succeeds, particularly in environments where speed is mistaken for competence and noise is confused with leadership. But a moment arrives when they sense something differs about you. It's subtle initially. You don't interrupt. You don't rush to insert your perspective. You don't compete for attention. Instead, you observe how people speak when they desire something, how their tone shifts when they feel insecure, how their reasoning bends when their position weakens. You notice who talks excessively when nervous and who becomes silent when concealing something. These details accumulate quietly, forming a structure others don't perceive. The realization dawns gradually. You aren't responding to individual moves. You're tracking outcomes while they're focused on winning the moment. You're tracing where the moment leads. You hear not just what is expressed, but what must be true for it to be expressed in that manner. You sense contradictions before they become apparent. You recognize repeated strategies disguised as spontaneity. And once the pattern emerges, the rest becomes foreseeable. This is when discomfort transforms into anxiety. People begin to feel as though the dialogue is no longer under their control. The usual tactics, persuasion, emotional appeal, subtle pressure, stop producing results. They attempt to guide you, but you're already several steps ahead. They try to simplify complex matters, only to realize you're aware of the consequences they dismiss. They speak as though the situation is flexible while you're conscious of the constraints they cannot escape. What unsettles them most is that you don't reveal this understanding immediately. You don't correct them in real time. You don't challenge every flawed assumption. You allow them to continue, observing as they disclose more than intended. In doing so, they begin to sense they are being seen more clearly than is comfortable, not judged, understood, and understanding is far more threatening to a carefully maintained image than criticism could ever be. As this awareness grows, their behavior transforms. They become more protective. Their words grow careful. They test you indirectly, searching for signs of reaction or vulnerability. But you don't provide it. You respond calmly, selectively, and with precision. Each response confirms their suspicion. You are not improvising. You are operating from a broader perspective. Seeing the whole board means recognizing how individual decisions create ripples. You understand incentives, pressures, and unspoken alliances. You know when a choice stems from fear rather than logic, from ego rather than necessity. You can anticipate shifts in attitude before they are publicly acknowledged. And because of that, you are never surprised, only confirmed. This awareness creates a quiet imbalance. People recognize that while they attempt to influence you, you are simply assessing them. They sense the dynamic has shifted even if nothing visible has changed. You haven't asserted dominance. You haven't claimed authority, yet the space feels different. Conversations slow down. People select their words deliberately. The environment becomes tense not because of conflict, but because the illusion of control has dissolved. At that point, panic doesn't arrive as chaos, it arrives as restraint. People stop pushing. They stop engaging directly. They begin cautioning each other instead. Because once someone perceives the whole board, every move becomes accountable. And accountability is what most individuals were never prepared to encounter. Why do they caution each other about you? The warnings don't emerge from anger or open hostility. They appear quietly inside conversations and careful remarks meant to protect rather than confront. No one announces them publicly because there is nothing concrete to accuse you of. You haven't crossed a boundary. You haven't attacked anyone. Yet something about your presence makes people hesitate, and hesitation spreads faster than certainty. When others inquire what the issue is, the answers are vague, carefully phrased, and always indirect. What triggers this behavior is not what you do, but what you omit. You don't rush to explain yourself. You don't overshare. You don't perform vulnerability to gain trust. Your emotions aren't easily readable, and your motivations aren't apparent. In environments where people rely on emotional transparency as a tool for influence, this restraint is deeply unsettling. They can't anticipate you, and without anticipation, control becomes impossible. People who survive through manipulation depend on familiar signals. They look for flattery, insecurity, impatience, or the need for approval. These signals allow them to adjust their approach and maintain advantage. With you, those signals never appear. You remain composed, attentive, and selective. You listen fully, but you don't react impulsively. You respond only when it serves purpose, and even then your words are measured. This absence of exploitable behavior forces others into uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds caution, and caution, when shared, becomes warning. People begin advising one another to keep conversations superficial, to avoid revealing too much, to remain within safe topics, not because you demand it, but because they sense that exposure is possible. Your memory, your pattern recognition, your ability to connect statements across time makes careless honesty feel risky. Once someone realizes you don't dismiss inconsistencies, they become acutely aware of every contradiction they might reveal. What intensifies this reaction is that you never threaten exposure. You don't hint at what you know. You don't leverage information to gain status or compliance. You simply hold it. That restraint is interpreted as strength, even if you never frame it that way. People begin imagining consequences not because you create them, but because they recognize what could occur if clarity replaced ambiguity. Silence in this context feels heavier than accusation. As a result, people transform how they engage around you. They become less spontaneous. Their humor grows guarded. Their stories become polished versions rather than authentic ones. This shift isn't conscious initially. It's instinctive. Over time, however, it solidifies into a shared understanding. Engaging too deeply feels unsafe, not because you are hostile, but because you are attentive in a manner that cannot be managed. This is where the warnings take shape. They are passed along as advice rather than fear. Be cautious. Select your words. Don't reveal too much. Each warning reinforces the idea that you are someone to be approached carefully. The irony is that you never requested this role. It was assigned the moment people recognized they couldn't read you as easily as they read each other. The more these warnings circulate, the more your presence transforms the environment. People self-censor before you ever speak. They anticipate your understanding before you demonstrate it. In doing so, they reveal precisely why the warnings exist. They aren't protecting themselves from you. They are protecting themselves from being seen clearly. And so, without confrontation or declaration, a boundary forms around you. Not one you constructed, but one others built out of their own uncertainty. They caution each other not to engage too deeply because deep engagement demands honesty. And honesty in the presence of someone who listens this closely feels like a risk they are unwilling to accept. The psychology of remarkably perceptive individuals. The phrase itself carries a contradiction that unsettles people. Perception is usually praised, even celebrated. But when labeled as concerning, something deeper is being revealed. The concern isn't rooted in aggression or cruelty. It comes from precision, from the ability to see clearly without being clouded by emotion, ego, or the need to be liked. This kind of perception doesn't rush to judgment, yet it rarely misses the truth. And that accuracy is what makes others uneasy. Being remarkably perceptive means retaining more than isolated facts. You remember context. You remember tone. You remember patterns of behavior that repeat under different disguises. While others rely on impressions that fade with time, you carry a detailed internal map of interactions. You don't just recall what was said, but why it was said and what it attempted to accomplish. This depth of memory creates continuity where others experience fragmentation, and that continuity leads to insight they can't easily escape. Another element that fuels this perception is your ability to connect what appears unrelated. Small details, casual comments, minor inconsistencies, shifts in behavior are not dismissed as noise. They are integrated over time. These connections form a coherent picture that others never see because they are focused on isolated moments. When you finally speak, your words feel disproportionate to the conversation. Not because they are excessive, but because they cut through layers others didn't realize existed. This is where silence becomes a form of influence. You don't fill space unnecessarily. You don't speak to reassure others of your presence. Your restraint creates tension because people are accustomed to constant feedback. When feedback disappears, they begin projecting their own fears into the void. They assume you know more than you've stated, and often they're correct. This projection amplifies your perceived perception far beyond what you explicitly demonstrate. What truly intensifies the label is your selectivity. You don't respond to everything. You choose moments that matter. When you speak, it's clear you've considered the implications. There's no need to revise or retreat because your words were placed deliberately. This consistency builds a reputation quietly. People begin to notice that you rarely contradict yourself, rarely overextend, and rarely get caught in emotional traps. In a world driven by impulse, that steadiness feels abnormal. The concern from their perspective lies in the imbalance this creates. They rely on confusion, speed, or emotional pressure to gain advantage. You slow everything down. You remove urgency. You refuse to be rushed into decisions or reactions. That refusal disrupts strategies that depend on haste and distraction. Without realizing it, they are forced to confront their own lack of clarity. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. Importantly, this perception doesn't seek dominance. It doesn't need to win every exchange or assert superiority. That absence of overt ambition confuses people further. If you aren't attempting to control the environment, why does it feel controlled? If you aren't competing, why do others feel exposed? The answers are unsettling, so they avoid them. Instead, they label the perception itself as concerning, as if the problem lies in the observation rather than what is being observed. As this label circulates, it gains symbolic weight. Remarkably perceptive becomes shorthand for someone who cannot be easily manipulated, someone who sees through pretense, someone who remembers and connects. The concern is not what you might do, but what becomes impossible to do around you. Lies don't land cleanly. Performances feel hollow. Games lose their effectiveness. And so the phrase persists not as an accusation, but as a quiet acknowledgement. It reflects a collective recognition that precision, patience, and clarity shift power without ever announcing themselves. In that shift, people sense a loss of control, and rather than examine why, they name the perception itself as the threat. Why you don't need to prove anything. The need to prove oneself is often mistaken for confidence, but it is usually the opposite. It comes from uncertainty, from the urge to be seen, validated, or acknowledged. Those who feel compelled to announce their perception, strength, or importance are often trying to stabilize something fragile inside. You operate from a different place. Your actions aren't designed to impress, and your words aren't shaped to win approval. You move with an internal certainty that doesn't require witnesses. This absence of self-promotion is quietly disarming. In environments where status is earned through volume, visibility, and constant assertion, restraint feels unnatural. People expect signals, claims of expertise, declarations of intent, displays of confidence. When those signals don't appear, they don't assume humility. They assume calculation, and they are not incorrect. You understand that proving something is unnecessary when it will reveal itself through consistency. You allow others to speak first, not because you lack ideas, but because you value information over recognition. Every statement someone makes offers insight into how they think, what they want, and where they feel insecure. While others rush to establish their position, you gather clarity. This patience creates an asymmetry. They expose themselves while you remain composed, learning without revealing. There is also an understanding that proving something often invites challenge. Declarations create targets. Claims provoke resistance. By remaining understated, you avoid unnecessary friction. You don't engage in battles that don't matter, and you don't correct people who aren't prepared to understand. This selectivity is mistaken by some as indifference, but it is actually discipline. You know that energy spent proving yourself is energy taken away from seeing the situation clearly. When moments arrive that require your input, you don't elevate your tone. You don't dramatize your contribution. You speak plainly and precisely because you've already completed the thinking. There's no need for theatrics. The clarity of your words carries weight on its own. People notice that you don't repeat yourself, don't over-explain, and don't retreat from what you've stated. That consistency speaks louder than any attempt at persuasion. What truly unsettles others is that you don't seem invested in how you are perceived. You're aware of the room, but not governed by it. Praise doesn't inflate you, and criticism doesn't destabilize you. This emotional independence removes leverage. Without the ability to reward or punish you through opinion, people lose one of their most common tools of control. Over time, this approach reshapes the dynamic around you. Others begin performing more, not less, attempting to fill the space you leave open. They overstate, overcommit, and overreact. In contrast, your steadiness becomes more pronounced. You don't need to dominate the conversation to influence its direction. You don't need to announce your competence for it to be recognized. By refusing to prove anything, you allow reality to do the work for you. Outcomes, consistency, and quiet accuracy build a reputation that cannot be forced or fabricated. And in that calm refusal to perform, people sense something they can't easily name. A confidence that doesn't ask to be believed because it doesn't depend on belief at all. Let them whisper. Let them whisper if they need to. Let the quiet warnings circulate. passed carefully from one person to another as if your presence alone requires a disclaimer. Those whispers are not a sign of hostility. They are evidence of recognition. Recognition that you cannot be rushed, confused, or folded into someone else's agenda. People whisper when they don't have authority over a situation, when certainty escapes them, when clarity threatens the structures they depend on. Silence, after all, only surrounds things that carry weight. You were never meant to be obvious. Loudness attracts attention, but inevitability commands space without asking. While others announce themselves, you arrive already understood, sometimes too late for comfort. You don't chase relevance because relevance follows consequence, not noise. And consequence is something you've always respected. You understand that restraint is not absence and that patience is not passivity. It is preparation disguised as calm. When people hesitate around you, it is not because you intimidate them with force, but because you remove their excuses around you. Contradictions stand out. Performances lose their effect. Empty confidence collapses under quiet observation. You don't expose these things aggressively. You simply exist in a way that makes them visible. And visibility to those who rely on illusion feels like threat. So they label you instead. They assign meaning to your silence, intent to your composure, danger to your clarity. It is easier to name you as something exceptional than to confront what your presence reveals about them. Labels create distance. They allow people to avoid engagement while pretending it's a strategic choice. In truth, it's avoidance dressed up as caution. Let them hesitate. Hesitation is the pause that appears when instinct meets awareness. It's the moment people recognize they are no longer operating on autopilot. Your presence forces that pause not through dominance but through coherence. You are internally aligned in a way that doesn't fracture under pressure. That alignment is rare, and rarity is often misunderstood before it is respected. You were never meant to explain yourself endlessly. Explanation invites negotiation, and some truths are not negotiable. You live them. You demonstrate them through consistency, through how you listen, how you select your words, how you refuse to be pulled into chaos. Over time, people either adjust to that standard or move away from it. Both outcomes are appropriate. The whispers will fade for some and intensify for others. Those who value clarity will eventually approach cautiously at first, then honestly. Those who thrive on confusion will keep their distance, convinced you are something to be managed rather than understood. That separation is not loss. It is filtration. Not everyone is meant to engage deeply with someone who sees clearly. You don't need to confront the whispers or correct the narrative. Narratives collapse on their own when built on fear rather than truth. Your role was never to persuade everyone. It was to remain intact, to move through environments without compromising your perception or diluting your standards. That integrity does more than arguments ever could. So let the warnings circulate. Let people select their words carefully. Let environments grow quieter when you speak and stiller when you don't. None of this requires effort from you. It is simply the natural response to someone who cannot be easily influenced, redirected, or controlled. And when they say stay distant, what they are really admitting is this. You exist outside their reach, not above them, not against them, beyond their leverage. You were never meant to be loud. You were meant to be unavoidable.